partnership, special and privileged strategic partnership as it's called, is alive and kicking and healthy. 2 days ago, Prime Minister Modi was in Houston with President Trump, and they both declared before 50,000 Indian Americans in a football ground in Houston that the India-US partnership was thriving, that President Trump was making a great contribution to it, that they are going to further strengthen the partnership in every possible direction. He even seemed to be endorsing Mr. Trump to the extent of saying, "Ab ki baar Trump sarkar," at the Houston rally. So, if you look at these two, and remember that Russia and the US have had a major standoff over the last 5 years at least, you see some of the ways in which India is meeting the challenges of its relationships with its great powers. The picture that you see on the screen is from the G20 summit in Buenos Aires last November, where you see two sets of trilaterals. You had India, Japan, US trilateral, or Japan, America, India, J, they called it, a trilateral. And you had the RIC trilateral, which is the Russia, India, China trilateral. Again, each of the two partners of Prime Minister Modi in each picture do not get along with the two partners in the other picture. And yet, the fact that both of them trilateral took place indicates the importance that these leaders attach to relations with India. So this is what I'm going to be talking about as briefly as possible today, to see how India is managing these relationships. Now, I want to start with a caveat. I was introduced as chairman of the National Security Advisory Board. I think you should know it is an advisory body. I'm not in government. Therefore, you should not take everything that I'm saying as government policy or my endorsement of government policy. Yes, I do understand India's perspectives, and I've been in the Foreign Service for about 37 years. So I do understand what Indian government perspectives are as well, but I'm not always sticking to that. The other thing I want to say is that you say India and the great powers, I'm largely going to be talking about the US, Russia, and China. It doesn't mean that others are not great powers. I think our relations with Japan are very important. Our relations with Europe are very important, and with individual countries in Europe. It's just that time, there is a constraints of time. Japan will come in various places in my presentation, and so will Europe here and there. The point is that Europe today is going through a major upheaval itself, a political and economic upheaval, not only because of Brexit, but because of a number of other economic reasons as well, which sort of, in a way, has affected India's relations with Europe lately. Okay, let's start with our neighbors. The neighbors are a very important element of the foreign policy of any country, and the management of the neighborhood is critical to your stepping out onto the world scene. And of course, it is important to understand that relations with neighbors are impacted by relations with great powers. So this, what you see on the screen, is a map of India. It's a map of India which has been around since the early 1950s, since our cartographic exercise began. I'm saying this because you'll see at the top of the screen the state of Jammu and Kashmir, which has been much in the news recently. This is the shape of the state of Jammu and Kashmir that India has been putting out since the time of its independence. It was the state of Jammu and Kashmir which acceded to India under the terms that the then colonial masters Britain set down, the rules that they set down for accession of states into the Union of India. Events took place in 1947, which resulted eventually in the Pakistani occupation of a large part of the state. I don't know if I'll be able to show. Yeah, the portion of this state which I'm just showing. In the war with China in 1962, another chunk, which is called Aksai Chin, was occupied by China. India never stopped stating that these are still parts of India. India never stopped saying that, it is the ultimate objective of India to recover its lost territory. Therefore, whatever happened on 5th of August, I'm coming to that, whatever happened on 5th of August, by which India changed certain methodologies of governance within the state of Jammu and Kashmir, is something that we have done in our territory. It should not concern anyone. It should not concern the external world where nothing has changed. The areas which India claims are its remain claimed by India. Our commitment to bilateral dialogue with countries in order to resolve this issue remains so. So this is a point I want to mention when we are looking at what was the external reaction and what is the attempts made by our neighbor Pakistan to stir up emotions outside the country on the decisions we took in Jammu and Kashmir. And if you look at the reaction of the great powers, other than China, most of the major countries of the world accepted this as an internal development of India. Anyway, this was by way of a bit of digression. But what are our issues with our neighbors? One of the basic issues is that we have an asymmetry of size with all our South Asian neighbors. I'm not counting China in this. And the asymmetry of size brings with it its problems, which is an apprehension which every small neighbor has about political, economic, and cultural domination by the bigger country. And then this is small nation syndrome is a universal syndrome. It's everywhere. You have large countries surrounded by small countries. You have also ethnic and cultural links. If you look at it, Nepal borders UP and Bihar, and there are cultural affinities between populations on either side of the border. Similarly, Bangladesh and West Bengal, which don't need any elaboration. Similarly, northern Sri Lanka and Tamil Nadu, and of course Pakistan and very many cultural affinities. Now, this is a double-edged sword. I mean, it means that populations on this side of the country are concerned about the conditions of living of population on the other side of the country, whereas the governments feel that their sovereignty is being affected if the big nation starts interceding on behalf of the ethnic minority. So the other issue, of course, is playing off one big neighbor against another. Again, wherever countries can do that, they will do that. You should expect it in order to get the most out of what they can do. In our case, there is this big country called China, which is proximate to all our neighbors. And the temptation to play off one country against the other is inevitable. It's something that we have to keep in mind. It is something that we have to also factor in our relations with these countries and with the big powers. In the case of Pakistan, of course, there is a sui generis problem. Pakistan, the conditions and the circumstances in which Pakistan was created has ensured that there is and the self-image of the leadership of Pakistan, which has for most of the years of its existence has been the military, has ensured that there is a constant tension on the India-Pakistan border. There has been the sponsorship of terrorism, which in India, which Pakistan has indulged in. And in the last 10 years, it has also been exacerbated by what Pakistan is doing in Afghanistan. And if you take a look at it, Afghanistan is very strategically located on the other side of Pakistan from India. Pakistan looks at Afghanistan as an area of its strategic depth. And we saw what happened in the 1990s when Afghanistan was under Taliban rule, when Pakistan used Afghan territory in order to train and arm terrorists, which would then be unleashed in Jammu and Kashmir. So on the one hand, Pakistan would like to use Afghanistan as an extended area of operations against India. On the other hand, they would like to prevent India from establishing a foothold in Afghanistan, because it sees then hostile countries in Pakistan's perspective on either side of it. So Afghanistan has become a very important strategic game between India and Pakistan as well. Let's get on to our big neighbor, China. Well, India and China have a border of more than 4,000 kilometers. The entire border is undemarcated. The entire border has been inherited from time when both China and India were colonies, if you like, when China did not have the freedom to, according to it, decide its own border. So we have this entire length of the border which is undemarcated, but really speaking, there are only a few parts of it which are really contentious. One is Aksai Chin, the portion that I mentioned before, which China occupied in 1962, and which China considers of strategic value to it because it actually connects two parts of China. That is, if you're willing to admit that Tibet is a part of China. You have Arunachal Pradesh, which particularly since 2009, I think it was, China has is calling it South Tibet and has claims to almost the entire state. And there is this problem near the India-Bhutan-China border, whose exact location is a matter of dispute between India and China. And where we had 2 years ago the standoff with the Indian and Chinese troops had a standoff at Doklam. In addition to that, a strategic challenge we have with, a strategic challenge which we have with China is its axis with Pakistan. The China-Pakistan axis is something that has been developed right since the 1950s when China assisted Pakistan with its military, with its missile capability, with its nuclear capability. It has been an unwavering supporter of Pakistan in its campaigns against India on multilateral fora. It is basically a very strong, its objective really has been to box India into the South Asian space so that it doesn't emerge onto the big screen. This has been a Chinese ambition vis-a-vis India. It has made inroads into Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives in recent years. And in recent years, its Belt and Road Initiative, which seeks to extend Chinese economic reach across Eurasia into Europe through economic corridors supported by its industry and by loans. And I just want one more thing I want to say about the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which goes from West China through Pakistan all the way to the Makran coast. It is a corridor which built with transportation links, power links, optical fiber cables. It is a method by which China strengthens its hold in Pakistan and reaches up to the Makran coast to the west of India, where Chinese are also building an airport there. The Chinese Navy will for the first time be situated to the west of India. This is a major strategic challenge. China is India's greatest strategic challenge, the great strategic challenge for Indian foreign policy. So the BRI is an extension of this. It surrounds India, and then you have the Maritime Silk Road, which is the maritime segment of the Belt and Road Initiative, by which China seeks to strengthen its presence in ports where China seeks to strengthen its presence in ports all around India. The Chinese claim is that they are trying to strengthen secure the sea lanes of communication and commerce across the Indian Ocean, protecting its own commercial sea lanes. But India sees it as an area where it cannot actually have a strategic rival controlling the space. I'll come to that. This is part of India's Indo-Pacific strategy. I will come to that a little later. China has also, in the last 10 years, followed a very assertive policy in its own neighborhood, claiming territories in the South China Seas, which enable it to virtually make the South China Sea into a China Sea. These islands which they have actually occupied and created facts on the ground in order to strengthen their case for owning it. So it has it's not only India, but the regions in the neighborhood of India which have felt the impact of Chinese assertiveness in recent years. At the same time, India needs to recognize, well, India developed relations with China very strongly in the first part of the early 2000s. This was a time when the post-Cold War situation had not settled down into in the configuration of great powers as it has done today. India was able to strengthen relations with China. We actually created a situation, we agreed with China that the border question should be discussed at a political level, and we should seek to see whether we can arrive at a settlement through using political arguments. So the two leaders appointed their special representatives. So we had considerable progress with China in the period from 2003 to 2005, when we decided on political parameters that should control the settlement of the boundary. Indian-China relations, actually the economic relations, flourished thereafter. China soon grew to become India's largest trade partner. It became an important investor. And as you can see today, Chinese products flood the Indian market, whether it's smartphones. Almost every second Indian has a Chinese smartphone. Maybe it's an even bigger number. OnePlus and Vivo, Lenovo dominates the market. Our pharmaceutical industry is dominated by raw materials from China, API. 70% of the raw materials for our pharmaceutical industries come from China. We say that we are going to go into electric vehicles. Well, where does the lithium come from? From China. So we have a number of linkages. So while we have a strategic rival on one side, let's not forget, it is a large country, it is a powerful country, it has 5 times the GDP of India, it has 10 times the foreign exchange reserves, it's a permanent member of the UN Security Council, it's a nuclear weapon power. We need to learn how to live with this country, balancing both the strategic challenges as well as the economic opportunities. And of course, we have some common interests in multilateral fora as well, in the WTO, in the IMF, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which I will come to a little later. So the strategy really is that you need to defend your core interests, where, like we did in Doklam, and at the same time build balancing coalitions, and we come back to that Indo-Pacific strategy. The early 2000s also saw a very strong strengthening of the strategic partnership between India and the US. The shackles of the Cold War had been removed. The US saw India as now a big market. We had our economic reforms had started working, and India's economic growth picked up considerably. The US also saw India as a huge market for defense sales. We were and still are the world's largest arms importer, and at that time, almost entirely dependent on Russia for our arms import. The US saw a huge opportunity there. At that time, the US nuclear energy industry was also keen to enter India, and therefore there was this the other incentive to try to engage India. From India's perspective as well, we seized the opportunity to build relations with the sole superpower of the world. We trade, investment, technologies from America were of great attraction. The Indian diaspora, as we saw in Houston 2 days ago, was an important link in the connections between India and the US. We wanted the diaspora to invest in India. We wanted the diaspora to help in Indo-US relations as well. So you saw defense sales, US defense sales grow astronomically from about 1 billion in 2008 to about 18 billion last year. Nuclear energy, well, the US companies meanwhile have changed their orientation, but what the US did do was to help push through an international nuclear deal with India that opened up civil nuclear cooperation with India, which was of tremendous use to us. And I'll come to that a little significant just a little bit later. From India's perspective, we also felt that a strong relationship with the US would sort of pressurize it to restrain Pakistan's anti-terror activity against India, not to mediate between India and Pakistan, but essentially not to sell the kind of arms that will eventually be used against us. And the other great help with our US, the other great advantage of our US relationship in the 2000s was our presence in Afghanistan. As the US and international forces set about supporting democracy in Afghanistan, it gave space for India to enter with its development assistance to Afghanistan. And India today has an exposure of well over $2 billion in economic exposure to economic assistance to Afghanistan. And then there was this critical element, the strategic underpinning of the India-US relationship was this partnership in China's neighborhood. Even then, in the early 2000s, the US began to see China as a potential rival to its status as a sole superpower of the world. And looked at India, post-Cold War India. It felt that India had shed its inhibitions of non-alignment. Its nuclear tests indicated that India was willing to take a more muscular position in its neighborhood in support of its positions. And it was a democracy. So the friendship with a democracy to balance China, though no one ever called it balancing China, and yet that was at the back of the mind, a strong India in Asia to balance China was very much a strategic underpinning. And this is something that one needs to remember at all stages, even when one goes through all these trade tariffs disputes with the US on various other frictions which you have with the US on policies. This strategic underpinning of the India-US relationship in the context of India's own position in its neighborhood, I think is very important. And we must remember that if the US was willing to fight against its own high priests of non-proliferation in order to get civil nuclear cooperation open for India, it was because it saw this strategic picture of relations with India. At the same time, because US-Russia relations had not actually deteriorated by then, and because the US was still trying to shape Russia in its own image post-Soviet Russia, India was able to strengthen its traditional relationship with Russia. There's a history, of course, during the Cold War, where Russia was a solid bulwark of support for India in all its core issues. It cast vetoes in the UN Security Council at critical times on matters of India's interests, whether it related to Jammu and Kashmir, whether it related to the war with Pakistan for the liberation of Bangladesh, or India's taking back Goa from Portugal. It helped our industrializing the newly independent India. And it, of course, gave us military support that built up our defense potential in almost the entire range of equipment in our Army, Air Force, and Navy. Now, this is something that after Russia itself recovered from its political chaos of the 1990s, post-breakup, when President Putin came in, a new lease of life was given to Russia relations. Defense became a very important pillar of the relations, and that no country, and that's true even today, no country gives us as much military technology as Russia does. And then our relationship has gone into joint research, into development, into manufacture in India, of missile systems, of assault rifles, of helicopters, a whole range. Nuclear energy, again, Russia is the only country which is today present in India's nuclear energy space, and both with technology and with fuel. Hydrocarbons, it's a superpower of the world in hydrocarbon, and we have benefited a lot, investment in both directions. From a strategic perspective, what the India-Russia relationship does is enable India to maintain a kind of a strategic autonomy, multipolarity as we call it, so that we are not actually completely tied to any one country. So there is Russia, there is US, and the Russian relationship also helps us manage our China relationship a little bit. So this is a very quick round of the three, but I think we should come to the challenges. What are the challenges? Now, you see, until such time as I said, the US was trying to shape Russia, post-Soviet Russia in its own image. China itself was still in the process of following the Deng Xiaoping maxim of building its strengths and lying low. The economic crisis, global economic crisis had not yet hit in 2008. When the global economic crisis hit in 2008, China stepped out onto the world scene with a much more assertive manner. The ascent of the advent of President Xi Jinping in 2012 exacerbated this. Over this period, the US economic interdependence on China also increased, which diluted some of the US opposition to what China was doing in its neighborhood. And the bottom fell out of this whole structure in 2014 with the accession or annexation of Crimea, depending on what your point of view is, with Russia. When US-Russia relations completely broke down. It broke down in a manner worse than what existed during the Cold War, with sanctions and with them fighting each other through their proxies and across from Ukraine to Syria to Afghanistan. Now, this created new challenges for all countries in the world, but importantly for India as well. As the anti-Russia tirade in the US strengthened, US sanctions against Russia. A number of sanctions were imposed on Russia by Europe and USA. But these sanctions were region-specific, they were technology-specific, they were people-specific, they were currency-specific. So they didn't affect countries outside those regions of Europe and the US and outside of people trading in dollars and euro. But in 2017, the US enacted a legislation called CATSA, Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, by which they could apply sanctions on any country doing business with Russia in particular areas that they identified. And those areas were basically as affecting India, military arms and weapons. And of course, energy was another one, but that affected Europe more than us. Now, this is what is the first challenge that India faced as a result of the defense cooperation that we've had with Russia over the years. About 60 to 70% of our arms and equipment in the armed forces is of Russian or China or Soviet origin. Their upgrades, their further development, new generations, therefore, require cooperation with Russia. Now, it's very clear that one of the objectives why CATSA was passed, besides punishing Russia, was also to try to wean countries away from Russian arms and into American arms. The problem that we have is that we cannot do this. Number one, we cannot do this suddenly because that will create vulnerability. It will create huge expenses. Number two, we don't want to do it either because we want to get the benefit of technologies from both countries. We still have the situation where Russia gives us more technology than the Americans do. Of course, that's an evolving situation which will consistently improve. But the dealing with America and getting America to get this picture that in the larger strategic understanding of India-US relations, which means a strong India in Asia, that itself requires an Indian military defense cooperation with Russia. So this is one of the challenges. Another challenge is that of Iran, which US policy on Iran presents to us. Now, if you look at the map, and geography is a very important part of foreign policy. If you look at the map, you see because of the problems that we have with Pakistan, there is no direct route from India to Pakistan. If you have to, to India to Afghanistan. If you have to reach Afghanistan, you've got to do that through Iran. So India needs, besides our traditional, cultural, civilizational links with Iran, you also have the simple fact that you need Iran to reach Afghanistan. You need Iran to reach Central Asia. And therefore, when we are building this, or where we are committed to build the international North-South transport corridor. What is the North-South transport corridor? It is a corridor, it's a multimodal corridor that takes you, trade corridor, that takes you from India's west coast to the port of Chabahar in Iran. We are committed to help in building a railway line up north to Zaidan, and from that we will then be connected to Afghanistan, to Central Asia, and even to Russia and Northern Europe. And this is a route that will be half the distance of the longer sea route that exists at the moment, half the freight, and therefore it can expand both India's economic possibilities with these countries as well as India's strategic links with the countries of Central Asia and Afghanistan, whose importance I mentioned to you. So again, we need to, our constant engagement with the US. Once again, the logic of the Indo-US strategic partnership itself should argue for our continuing with this, because what is also the other, our objective in these links is a foothold in Central Asia. And if you look at Central Asia, again, geography is very important. Central Asia is wedged between Russia, and China. And what does it border? It borders Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. So when you have complicated relations with your neighbors, you better have good relations with your neighbors' neighbors. So again, it is an important strategic objective. So it's something that we need to keep pursuing, and we need to be negotiating with the US to ensure that we retain our freedom of action. Now, this brings us actually to this question which is constantly being asked. What are we looking at? Are we looking at alliances, or are we looking at joint ventures? Joint venture, of course, is not only a commercial idea. Today, I think you need to look at a joint venture model even in foreign policy. Now, the US, as the sole superpower and from Cold War practice, is used to looking at partnerships more in terms of alliances. Now, an alliance, what is an alliance? An alliance needs a total congruence of interests. Now, that was possible during the Cold War, because during the Cold War, there was this ideological division between the Soviet communism and the so-called free world. There was a common threat, which was a threat from the Soviet Union, which bound together Europe with America, which bound Southeast Asia with America. And therefore, there was a very clear division. You don't have that congruence anymore. You don't have the ideological monolith anymore. So you see today, even Europe, which is the European Union, which has been one of our closest allies of the US is now threatening sanctions against it if it deals in energy cooperation with Russia. Turkey, which is a NATO ally, is today calls itself a strategic partnership of partner of Russia. Japan, another US ally, is actually uneasy about what the US is doing in North Korea, wondering whether its own interest is itself. So, this is not the age of alliances. It is the age of joint ventures. It is the age where you partner with countries to the extent of interest that you have with them, leaving you free to partner with other countries with which you have other shared interests, provided only that you ensure that the core sensitivities of each partner is protected, or is you are sensitive to the core interests of the joint venture partner. Now, you look at it also, if you look at it from a geographical perspective, you have two close, proximate big powers, Russia and China. Now, it's impossible to seek to form an alliance with the US, which will create hostility from these two proximate partners, because you don't expect your rich uncle from the next village to protect you from your hostile neighbor next door. So it's also another reason why geography argues against a sole alliance that India can have with the US or with China or with Russia, for that matter. The other aspect, of course, which is a link to this, is that the Russia-China strategic partnership, which has now developed much more because of the 2014 onward standoff with the West, is something that worries India. It is something that India needs to constantly monitor. It is something that for which India has to see that Russia has sufficient stakes in India not to carry its strategic partnership with China to the extent that it can hurt India, whether it is in relation to Pakistan or whether it is in relation to other major issues in the UN or elsewhere. So, our relationship with powers, therefore, I want to say, should be fashioned more around the lines of joint ventures than alliances. And the next major challenge, another major challenge, and this relates to what I said earlier about what China has been doing in our region and what America wants India to do in our region, is an Indo-Pacific security. Now, what is the Indo-Pacific? From an Indian definition, the Indo-Pacific is the region, entire oceanic space from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. Now, why is it important for us? India is in a very strategic location on this oceanic space, astride the maritime corridors of East-West Maritime Corridor. It is also becoming, thanks to China, thanks to the US response to China, one of the most militarized areas. Now, 90% of India's foreign trade is in the Indian Ocean, comes from the Indian Ocean. Most of its oil, half of its LNG comes from there. Its marine resources are very important for India's economy. Crimes like drugs and arms and people smuggling are crimes that India needs to control. There are, and let's not forget also that the worst act of terrorism against India, which was on 26th of November 2008, came from seaborne terrorists. So we have a 7,500 kilometer coastline which we need to protect. Therefore, the thought of another country, even if benign, controlling the waterways around India and having a hegemony around India in the Indo-Pacific Ocean space, India cannot accept. So this is now this is a fundamental reality of the Indo-Pacific. Now, what is the Indo-Pacific? Why Indo-Pacific? How is it different from Asia-Pacific? Asia-Pacific is the concept that we've grown up with during the Cold War. It is a concept, Asia-Pacific, essentially related to the space, which is the specific space basically between Southeast Asia, Australasia, and the US. It was a Cold War construct. It was a construct based on the US providing a security umbrella to Japan and Korea and others, and Australia against the Soviet Union. It depended on a China which since 1972 was somewhat neutral. Now, as I said earlier, the ideological underpinning of the Cold War has collapsed. ASEAN is no longer as united in its views on this subject. So the Asia-Pacific Cold War construct has collapsed. And more important than that, from India's perspective, India was not in that construct. When APEC was formed, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, India was not included. India still is not included in it. Even when ASEAN, the Asia-Europe meeting framework was formed, India was not included in it. India was included in it 10 years after it was formed. So Asia-Pacific is a construct that includes India. And, you know, if you look at the second biggest country in this region, with a 1.3 billion population and a $2.6 trillion economy, to exclude it from the deliberations of a region in which it has critical interest is simply not on. And therefore, when the India-Pacific construct is something that actually includes India in it, as I said, it includes India in the deliberations of relations in it. And now, if you look at what we're doing in the India-Pacific, what the objective in the India-Pacific, our Indo-Pacific approach. Now, we say that Indo-Pacific is not, our Prime Minister said in his Shangri-La speech in Singapore last year, the Indo-Pacific is not a club, it is not a strategy, it is a geographical space. Yes, we will say that, but we should also see it is an approach that we want to have with other countries in the region, which will prevent the hegemony of any one country in that region. You need to have a cooperative approach where interests of countries in the region are protected. And for that, we need to work towards what, we need to work towards cooperative relationships with countries. Now, this is where I said earlier, the US is a major partner. The US, for its own reasons, would like to prevent China's hegemony from spreading across the region. Besides, of course, keeping the Indo-Pacific region open for lines of commerce, trade, communication, and not having military hegemony of a power there. So India's partnership with the US has included also joint naval exercises called Malabar with Japan. We have the Quad dialogue with Japan and Australia, but these are only the beginnings of an approach. India also seeks to broaden multilateral as well as bilateral approaches, relations with countries in the region who are also, who feel the heat of China's assertive actions. China's occupation of territories of islands in its area, China's and China's disputes go further east also with Japan as well. So India has strengthened its strategic partnership with Vietnam. India has with Indonesia, with Australia. We also have tried to promote cooperation in an area of the Indian Ocean, which is the Bay of Bengal. We've tried to revive really cooperation in what is called BIMSTEC, basically the Bay of Bengal Initiative for multi-sectoral technical and economic cooperation, title. But essentially, it's a grouping of Indian Ocean littorals, which Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and India, to revive maritime cooperation in this area, to also try to see whether our security cooperation can be tightened. In 2016, we actually started a forum of national security advisors of these countries. Of course, the great advantage of BIMSTEC is that it's a multilateral organization in our neighborhood which cannot be sabotaged by Pakistan and cannot be dominated by China. And I think that's a very important plus point for it. In my view, of course, BIMSTEC will get a lot of strategic clout if the two countries of Malaysia and Indonesia also join it. The Straits of Malacca being here. And it is an area which India has vital interest in also because the Indian Andaman and Nicobar Islands are virtually at the mouth of the Straits of Malacca. So, and this brings us now, I think, towards one of the last slides, to Prime Minister in Vladivostok. One of the things that we've been trying to do is one of the outcomes of Prime Minister's visit to Vladivostok, besides strengthening the India-Russia strategic partnership, besides adding a new pillar to the partnership, that is hydrocarbons and Far East development, was also to bring Russia into our dialogue on the Asia-Indo. Russia has been deeply suspicious of the Asia-Pacific concept. Its leaders have in fact said that it is a ploy of the US in order to draw India into an alliance with it, together with Japan, against Russia and China. Now, our perspective is not that at all. And this is something that our dialogue with Russia has been stressing. The Prime Minister's dialogues with President Putin, as he said also during his their meeting in Sochi last year, as well as this year, has been to get Russia more interested in an Indo-Pacific dialogue that looks at it not as an alliance against it, but as part of a cooperative venture in order to secure a security equilibrium in the region. Now, one would say that Russia-China strategic partnership may prevent Russia from doing so. That's not actually so. If you look at it, Russia's own concept of Greater Eurasia, as spelled out by President Putin and as fleshed out by many of his advisors in various documents of theirs, talks about how Russia can act at the core of a multilateral web of cooperation in Eurasia that ties China into a web of relationships that prevents it from exercising hegemony over other countries which they will never accept, whether it is Japan or Korea or India. So this is a concept that Russia has been toying with. The idea is to now somehow translate it into practical measures and to draw Russia into cooperation, which will take forward this thought. Now, having said all that, I think we should recognize that the whole idea of an Indo-Pacific security equilibrium is still a work in progress. It is not something that's going to be achieved tomorrow. You will need to chip away at it with bilateral, multilateral dialogue mechanisms. I think to let rhetoric advance over reality is not a good idea. It is something that has to develop over the years, and most importantly, it can actually make progress only if there is a modicum of adjustment between the US and Russia. US, Russia, and China, all three of them, and India, have to participate in dialogue over an Indo-Pacific security architecture, along with the other countries of the region, for it to actually develop into something that will meet the aspirations of the countries of the region. But that is India's Indo-Pacific approach. I'll stop here. Basically, this is a summation of what we're trying to say, that India needs to protect its strategic autonomy in a multipolar world in order not to be able, not to have to come totally under the thumb of one or the other major powers. And for that, we need pragmatic engagements with all the countries, USA, Russia, China, Japan, Europe. These relations have to be ideology free. These relations have to be nimble. If you look at what's happening in the world around us today, as I said, Europe, America's closest ally, is now threatened by sanctions by America for dealing with Russia on energy. Look at Turkey, which is a NATO ally, which is today close to Russia. Look at other things that are happening in the world today. I mean, Japan, which sees China as a strategic adversary, is now trying to hedge by cozying up to China in the BRI. UAE and Saudi Arabia, which are close allies in most of the Gulf regions, are actually on opposite sides of a war in Yemen, though this is being played out very quietly. So there is a whole lot of a mix, a churn in global politics. We need to recognize that, and we need to be ahead of the curve in various ways in this. And that is where our relations with the great powers have to lead us. Thank you.
And also direct your attention to the questions they've asked. Some of them you've already answered in your presentation.
How should India handle old friend relationship with Russia and background of new enhanced? I said this very clearly. You know, you cannot. You have to retain your friendship with Russia, and you have to make sure that it does not interfere with your friendship with America and with your engagement with China. And in fact, it is not an impossible thing. There are things that you're doing with Russia which eventually are in the interest of the US as well, as I said in my presentation. India's business with Russia, China will be impacted among trade war, China, US, Iran problems. See, India's business with Russia, if you talk about business with Russia, it is one of the weaker parts of the India-Russia relationship. We have been trying to broaden the base of our relations for a long time now, particularly because also, if they are solely dependent on defense, then any dilution of the defense partnership then affects the relationship. So the whole idea, including during PM's visit to Vladivostok, was to broaden the base of our economic partnership, which is very important in order to keep mutual stakes strengthened. And now, if you look at even what I said about the North-South Transport Corridor, one of its consequences will also be to strengthen economic partnership with Russia. We are also negotiating for a free trade agreement with the Eurasian Economic Union, which consists of Russia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Belarus, in order to, again, strengthen conditions for economic partnership. So, India-Russia economic partnership is independent of the US-China standoff. Now, US-China trade standoff, well, India should be able to benefit from it, provided it is able to provide competitive conditions for US companies which want to trade from China. Our recent decision to cut corporate tax was one which I think will help in this. It is something that we need to work on, but it is independent of India-Russia relations. Now, US-Iran problems, I did mention there that, you know, what we are doing in Iran is in the long term, to the long-term advantage of the US itself. Look, the US also wants to have a direct line to Central Asia and in some way wean Central Asia away from China and Russia. So it should not be really objecting to our developing relations with Central Asia, and that can be done only through Iran. What else? Renewable power targets. energy security of the country. You see, look, we are doing a lot, and this government has done much more for energy security of the country than many previous governments. The arrangements that we have with Russia on hydrocarbons, the arrangements that we have entered into with West Asian country on hydrocarbons. Today we are also importing oil and LNG from the US. So you are diversifying your sources of supplies. You are also building up strategic reserves, oil reserves in the country, and involving a range of countries in these strategic reserves. The Solar Alliance, where India has taken a leadership, is the other area of promoting renewable, promoting renewable energy. We have a robust nuclear energy program, which at the moment it's only Russia which has joined us in this. So we have actually a whole range of initiatives for energy security, which cuts across both the conventional, traditional, and renewable energy. After US withdraws from Afghanistan, what is expected political? Yeah, no, this is actually a very sensitive situation. It's a very difficult situation right now. India was not in favor of the manner in which it was reported that the US was withdrawing from Afghanistan, because we felt that it would actually give the Taliban a free pass into Afghanistan, and Pakistan through the Taliban a free pass in Afghanistan, which cannot be in our interest. We hope, and now with the new situation, that if and when the US pulls out of Afghanistan, it will be on terms that protects the democracy in Afghanistan, that protects the gains that have been made in Afghanistan over the last 20 years or 19 years. It's something that it's a part of our ongoing conversation with the US, with Russia, and even with China for that, within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Do we need a specific Department of Border Security? We do have a border management department in the Ministry of Home Affairs. Which camp will India be in? I've answered that question. India should be in no camp except India's camp. And what you need to be doing, as I said, is don't look at as camps. Camps were part of the Cold War mentality. Today you look at joint ventures. You do a joint venture with countries. Some joint ventures are than others, and some joint ventures have a higher stake of yours than that of the partner, and the others it's the reverse. So think of relationships today as joint ventures which are across the board with countries. Do you think PM Modi will succeed in getting back POK? I cannot answer that question. It is not something that you can answer today or tomorrow. And really, I mean, there is, beyond saying that, look, we have a firm conviction that Pakistan occupied Kashmir is actually Indian Kashmir. I cannot say much. That carries with it itself the seeds of policy, that statement. Apart from defense equipment, what other business areas? I said this, hydrocarbons is a big area of India-Russia cooperation, and this is already happening. Indian companies have investments of something like $10 billion in the hydrocarbon sector in Russia. Russia has an investment of about $13 billion in a refinery in India, and some retail outlets as well, and others. Russia is one of the world's largest repositories of natural resources, and India is a natural resource hungry country. One of the things that happened in Vladivostok when PM was there, a whole series of agreements on exploitation of natural resources in the Russian Far East, which includes coal, it includes diamonds, of course, it includes a number of other natural resources, where we can profitably, to mutual benefit, have investments with Russia to strengthen, broaden the base of our economic cooperation. Mediate between India and Pakistan. Look, I've already said very clearly that we don't want mediation between India and Pakistan. What we need is for Pakistan to stop terror, and that is the best mediation that can take place. Tell Pakistan to stop terror. Where are we? What else? Everything moves around with the fact who control global oil conditions. This is no longer the case. You see, the global oil supply has diversified. OPEC is not now the sole supplier. The US is a supplier of oil. Russia is a major supplier of oil. the LNG has actually created a whole new situation where you liquefy the natural gas and then you can transport it just like you transport oil. And finally, of course, the primacy of oil. Of course, people have been talking about this for a very long time, that the primacy of oil in the global economy will fade away. That's something far in the future. But the point is that today you have a much more diversified situation as far as fossil fuels are concerned. So OPEC, rather West Asia, no longer has the stranglehold on the oil economy that it did before. USA sanctions, I did talk about US sanctions on Iran. We have to somehow find a way of continuing our commitment to Chabahar port, continuing our commitment to the North-South transport corridor, because it's going to be a huge advantage for us, and it's going to be a huge advantage. Let us look at this. The International North-South Transport Corridor, unlike the Belt and Road Initiative, which basically funds, which basically caters to Chinese export opportunities to Eurasia, this actually connects up East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia to Afghanistan, Central Asia, Europe, Russia and Europe in a much faster trade route at much lower freight. So it can have a game-changing impact on trade and economic relations of the whole of Asia with Europe. And that for that, you have to get a carve out of the sanctions to enable this to take place. Where are we? Project 75 is a step. Is that P75? I suppose that means the submarine we're talking about. The P75 submarine. Well, look, India has been, and I did mention India's security interests in the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific. Which this means that India has to strengthen its naval presence in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, not at the behest of another great power, but for our own security. And Project 75 is one of the many steps that the Indian Navy is taking in order to strengthen its presence in the Indian Ocean to protect our interests. Was it appropriate for President PM Modi to declare India's candidate? Well, look, there are ways of looking at this. One is, look at the number of countries that actually stuck their necks out to extend their support to Prime Minister Modi through state awards, through inviting him before our 2019 elections. What were they trying to do? They were trying to essentially say that, look, we believe that you're going to continue. We believe that we want to continue our relations with you. What are we doing? Much the same. We've had a good relations with the US. What Prime Minister Modi was basically telling President Trump is that, look, you've been good for India-US relations, and we therefore endorse you. Having said that, in the same meeting, he was also able to put forward very strongly our case on Jammu and Kashmir, our case on Article 370. He was able to talk about Pakistan. So, you know, you take a look at the whole package. So you've said something. You've said something to indicate your support for the president, but you've also woven into the same conversation a lot of things which you've been able to put out in the public domain to the people of America, to the president of the US and to the world. I think you should look at it as a package, and I think it was a great package. How is it to bilateral relations with engagement with Australia? It's very important. Look, it's just that I could not mention countries one by one, but if you look at the Indo-Pacific region, Australia is very important in that. And the Quad now includes Australia. Australia is a country which has, very similar to India, both extensive economic engagement with China and yet feels the impact of Chinese actions in the region. So we have a great identity of interest with Australia on Indo-Pacific issues. Now the problem in this entire Indo-Pacific dialogue is that because of the interdependence with China of every country in the Indo-Pacific region, actions that we take have to be measured, and that is why, again, rhetoric should never outstrip reality. We should not let rhetoric move ahead of reality. We need to work quietly until we have created the capacity to achieve what we want to achieve. Do we have any other? What could be expected India's engagement in Central Asia? You know, I did mention the importance of Central Asia to us from a geographical and a strategic perspective. And I can take you back to the slide which shows that. There you go. Central Asia is sandwiched between Russia and China. Central Asia is it now showing the real time? Yes, it is. Yes. So Central Asia is sandwiched between Russia and China. It is seeking to also create its own identity. Central Asia itself is seeking partnership with India in order to sort of not get boxed in by Russia and China. And that suits us perfectly fine because, as I said, Central Asia borders countries that we have issues with. So you want to have a presence in Central Asia so as to have an influence on the neighborhood below that. And that's why the Central Asian policy that, you know, in July 2015, when our Prime Minister came to Russia for the BRICS summit, he made it a point to visit each one of the 5 Central Asian countries at that time. And that has given a fillip to our relations with Central Asia. Of course, we need to keep following up and we need to keep taking that forward in the SCO format. The SCO format gives us a wonderful platform to do so.
Actually, would also know what is the role of SCO? Yeah, but it's linked.
What is the role of SCO in global affairs? Good question. Many answers. Various people look at SCO in various different ways. But we, as India, you know, what happened? The SCO was created in the end of the 1990s and early 2000s, essentially as a method for China to resolve its issues with the Central Asian countries and Russia. It has gradually developed into a cooperative organization that is looking at political issues in the region. That it is by no means anything like a NATO of this region, as some people would like to portray it. It is not, as you see, actually this SCO does not, China makes sure that SCO does not become a platform for carrying out Russia's, as a proxy for Russia's relations with the West. It is an organization that really can promote economic cooperation, that can promote security cooperation in the region to some extent. The SCO has a contact group from Afghanistan. Because all the countries in the region are affected if terrorism comes out of Afghanistan. So there are areas of security in the region which it can discuss because all the participants to that problem are in the region. So SCO is essentially a cooperative organization that can discuss regional issues. It should not start taking up Russia's or China's or India's relations with the outside world. It should certainly not try to sort out India-Pakistan issues as some people in Central Asia from time to time think that it can do. So it has an important but relatively limited regional role in its function.
Let's go to the last question, sir.
Last question. India lowered interest in Kazakhstan due in particular to its lower engagement in Afghanistan? No. This is definitely not so. India has strong relations with Kazakhstan, and please look at the map. Kazakhstan is a very important part of Central Asia, a natural resource rich part of Central Asia, and we are keenly interested in furthering cooperation with Kazakhstan, and in fact have done a lot in recent years to further relations with Kazakhstan. There's no question of diluting relations with Kazakhstan at all.
Just one.
How do we seek to act far east? Yes, what is act far east? This is what I was trying to actually, I don't know whether it came across. Act far east is basically 3 planks. 1 plank to strengthen, to add another pillar to the India-Russia strategic partnership, to draw Russia into the Indo-Pacific dialogue in a cooperative manner rather than a confrontation manner, and 3, to also include a link between Vladivostok and Chennai that can add a new trade corridor between India and Russia, which of course ties into our Indo-Pacific strategy as well. And that is why one would say it was an audacious, even an audacious announcement to say that I'll give you a 1 billion line of credit in order to develop the Russian Far East. Well, this is the kind of thing that actually demonstrates your commitment. And the spending of that 1 billion line of credit can actually bring a lot of commercial benefit to India. Lines of credit are used eventually to mutual benefit as well in industries and investments which have a mutual benefit. Thank you. Doing this again. Over to you.
Questions?
Yeah.
We would like to thank Ambassador Raghavan for joining us and for his excellent presentation. Thank you to all of you for joining. And that will be all for this evening. Thank you.